Hey everyone, I'm Andrew. Welcome to the 2022 MPS Shootout. The purpose of this shootout is to conduct an experiment that compares the capabilities of two cameras. These cameras being the Panavision Millennium DXL2 and the Sony FS7 Mark II. The FS7 is a relatively affordable camera and is marketed towards both small-scale professional cinema and video applications. The DXL2 is on the higher end of the camera spectrum. It is marketed specifically at the professional level and is designed to work in feature films and large-scale productions.
We got the cameras from New York City at Panavision headquarters. Our contact at Panavision, Chris, who was very nice enough to lend us the DXL2 for this project, brought us there, showed us how the camera worked, and we got some hands-on experience at the facility itself, which was really cool.
The DXL2 uses a Red Monstro 8K VistaVision sensor capable of 8K RAW capture, while the FS7 Mark II uses a 4K Super 35 Exmor sensor capable of 4K video capture. For the DXL2, we shot 8K Red RAW files with log3G10 encoding. The color space used by the camera was red wide gamut at a 6:1 red code compression. We shot at a 1600 ISO, which is the native ISO for the Millennium DXL2. We used a 0.3 ND filter to bring it down a stop and to treat the camera like an 800 ISO camera. For the FS7, we shot 4K RAW files in S-Log3 encoding. The color space we used was S-Gamut3 Cine. We shot uncompressed at a 2000 ISO using a 0.3 ND and 6.3 f-stop. This was done to treat the camera like an 800 ISO. The video you are watching now is an H.264 420 chroma subsampling 1080p video to meet criteria for the Tier 1 RIT SOFA specifications.
The FS7 uses the S-Gamut3 Cine color gamut, and the DXL2 uses the red wide gamut color space with log3G10 encoding. Color gamut is the area on a chromaticity diagram that represents the range of colors that a system can produce.
It is apparent that there is a clear disparity between the two cameras' physical technical capabilities. However, how apparent is this difference in practice? In other words, how different is the resulting experience on set and in post when using these cameras?
Chart day, baby. Say it. Say it again.
Chart day, baby. Chart day.
MTF stands for Modulation Transfer Function. It's the camera's ability to resolve edges and high-frequency detail within an image. The way we analyzed MTF was through slant edge analysis, which is taking the slanted edges on that chart and seeing how well the camera resolved the edges on that slant. The reason why we did this was because cameras with better MTF capabilities are able to resolve and keep more high-frequency information in an image that they capture on set.
The FS7 appeared to produce sharper lines on the MTF chart than the DXL2 did. However, the DXL2 performed much better in terms of minimizing aliasing. It's kind of surprising that the FS7, a 4K camera, would be able to capture sharper lines than the DXL2, which is an 8K camera. A reason for this may be that the DXL2 has built-in anti-aliasing capabilities. However, another possibility is that we just didn't focus the chart correctly, and this is what caused this issue to occur.
The sun is hot and the beach is good. Hang loose, coming through. You're gonna get a crisp wave coming in. So really hit the lip, hit it, hit the lip.
We use green screens so that we can put people, objects, and subjects into places that we wouldn't have access to on a normal set.
Beach is good. Beach is good.
You know what?
Hey,
Call me crazy.
call me beach is good.
Beach is good.
The reason why we did this test, this composite test for our shootout, was to analyze how well the two cameras were able to capture and maintain small details within the scene when we went to do the composite process in post.
So both cameras are able to produce a good, acceptable mask, with the DXL2 footage being much easier to work with to achieve a much cleaner mask. To accomplish this composite, we use the program Nuke For both cameras, a key light node was used. For this composite test, only the screen gain and screen balance were used to fine-tune the matte. For the DXL2, it was much easier to composite compared to the FS7, with very little adjustments needed to get a decent result. The FS7 composite has magenta artifacts around the finer edges in the scene, such as the hairs on the wig. The DXL2 composite does not suffer from these magenta artifacts as intensely, most likely due to the higher resolution and resolving power. Another difficult object in this scene to composite were the two glass bottles. We wanted to see how well we could key through the transparencies in the glass. Both cameras do a good job at compositing through the glass of the bottle, with the DXL2 doing slightly better at maintaining detail and having less noise. Another artifact present in the FS7 footage is noisy masking. This caused unwanted masking within the subjects in the composite, blending them with the background. This could be caused by noisy pixels found in the FS7 footage. The DXL2 had no instances of this issue occurring, as the footage was much cleaner.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
So for our next test, we shot the Macbeth color checker chart, which has a series of standardized color patches so that we can compare the colors and the noise between the two different cameras. On the day, we set up the color checker chart and we shot it with both cameras, one at a normal exposure, one at 2 stops under, and one at 2 stops over. So after bringing the color charts into DaVinci Resolve, we used the lift, gamma, and the gain functions to match the neutral series between the two cameras at each exposure. Even though the neutrals now matched, we noticed some color consequences on the rest of the patches in the chart. Here you can see the difference between the red patches. The DXL2 looks like a proper red, but the FS7 pushes this patch more towards a magenta. The yellow patch for the FS7 is also noticeably more saturated. We also see similar discrepancies in other patches between the two cameras. It was nice to see that the skin tone patches between the cameras were still kept reasonably similar. When underexposed, we can see that the colors overall are much less saturated. When corrected from an overexposure, the FS7 is also significantly more saturated overall. Comparing the FS7 underexposure to the DXL2 underexposure, it can be seen that the noise produced by the FS7 is worse. In the overexposure of each chart, there is no noticeable addition of noise, and in some patches, these charts even appear to have improved noise.
I memorized those colors. I know them colors. Them memory Yellow. Yellow. Blue. Red. Green. Purple.
Anybody have tape?
Memory colors are easily recognizable colors like your favorite logo or brand. We have an Oreo box, and I know what that blue looks like very well. Looking at this scene, we can see an array of familiar products on the table. In the FS7, the overall colors are more saturated. There is an emphasis on the blues and deeper magentas. This can be seen when looking at the blue chip bags and when comparing the Kit Kat and Coca-Cola colors between the scenes. The yellows are once again saturated in the FS7, and the greens are fairly well matched between the two cameras. When looking at the yellow bag of Lay's chips, the reproduction from the FS7 reminds us more of the bag we would see in real life. However, we think an accurate looking Lay's bag lies somewhere in between the colors produced by the DXL2 and the FS7. One of the most important things to be able to capture correctly in a camera is faces and colors. To test the color reproduction of each of the cameras, we had people of different skin tones come in and sit in front of each of the cameras while we recorded what they looked like. With this information, we're able to analyze how each camera is able to reproduce these colors and how they treat different skin tones. When working with the color in DaVinci Resolve, it was easier to produce more flattering skin tones with the DXL footage. As noticed on the Macbeth color chart, the FS7 has an emphasis on magenta and blue saturation zones. When working with skin tones in the FS7 footage, it was more difficult to decrease the emphasis on these magenta and blue hues to create a more natural, flattering looking skin tone. By only using the primary color correction tools available, lift, gamma, gain, it is difficult to decrease the effect of these hues without significant impact on the rest of the image. Overall, we found that the DXL2 produces a warmer image. Both the DXL2 and FS7 treat skin tones well, but they treat skin tones differently. It depends on the kind of look you are going for to determine which camera you would like to choose.
Andrew,
I'm the European Union.
You.
Next, we tested the camera's dynamic range. Dynamic range is how far into the shadows and how far into the highlights that a camera can capture without clipping or crushing the detail in the scene. We tested this in 2 different ways. The first way was using a dynamic range chart. This chart has 36 different patches that range from a bright white to a dark black. These images were able to tell us exactly where the camera clips or crushes information.
The Imatest dynamic range chart has 36 total patches showing a 10-stop dynamic range, which will be used to find where our cameras clip and crush. To determine our camera's dynamic range, the chart was captured at 3 different exposure levels. With the DXL2, we shot the dynamic range chart at a normal exposure, then 5 stops overexposed, and 4 stops underexposed. When analyzing the footage, we found that the DXL2 clips at around 8 stops above middle gray and crushes at around 5 stops under middle gray, which yields us a dynamic range of 13 stops, while Panavision claims to provide a dynamic range of up to 16 stops. To test the dynamic range of the FS7, we shot the camera at a normal exposure, 4 stops underexposed, and 4 stops overexposed. We found that the camera clips at around 7 stops above middle gray and crushes at around 4 to 5 stops middle gray. The total dynamic range we found during our testing was 11 to 12 stops, while Sony claims to achieve a dynamic range of 14 stops. So from the results of this analysis, we found that the DXL2 had a greater dynamic range, and we put the dynamic range of the 2 cameras to the test in the following scenes.
Did I interest you with a $5 fill-up from KFC?
Our second way of testing dynamic range was a little bit more practical. We built a scene in Magic Spell Studios with making shadows as deep and as dark as we could pull off, and trying to have the highlights in the scene as bright and blown out as possible. This was to give the camera the most extreme environment as far as dynamic range, to really push its capabilities and see exactly what they could do. We measured about 14 stops from the darkest shadows to the brightest whites in this scene. We begin in a dark area where we try to bring back as much detail from the shadows as we can. We pause here on the window to try to recover any information we can. And finally, we move to another brightly lit environment that falls somewhere between these 2 extremes. Let's break down in a little more detail each part of this scene.
For both the DXL2 and FS7, we shot a scene that was +1 stop overexposure and +2 stops overexposure. These scenes were then brought into DaVinci Resolve, where lift gamma gain processes were applied to see how much information we could retrieve from these images. For the DXL scene that was 1 stop overexposure, we were able to retrieve a decent amount of information from this bright scene. When the highlight information was brought down in this scene, some blue color became present in the shadows. However, this is not terribly intense. Overall, we were able to retrieve much more of the information from the scene than we were able to previously see. We can see more of the lace detail present in the window. For the +2 stops overexposure scene, we were not able to bring back as much information. This is because as the exposure of the scene was increased, more and more of the code values were reaching the threshold where information is lost and the values are clipped. When trying to bring back the information of the scene from this overexposed image, we were noticing that less blue was becoming present in the shadows. When looking at this image, you can see that we were able to achieve some recovery of the information of the scene. However, all the information from the areas of the image that have the primary highlights is unrecoverable. For the FS7, when we were trying to bring back detail in the highlights, we weren't able to maintain the same level of integrity of the images that the DXL2 was able to achieve. While we were able to recover some of the information of the scene in the 1 stop overexposure image, we found that the blue tones introduced through the highlight decrease was much more intense in the FS7, and we were unable to resolve this issue. If you're looking at it primarily from an information standpoint, we were able to retrieve the details of the image. However, the color quality of the scene was compromised. In the 2 stop overexposure scene, most of the information was gone with no possibility of retrieving it. The highlights were clipped, and this was prominent throughout the majority of the image. There were a few areas where we were able to get a little bit more information from the image. However, the end result shows very little detail. However, the blue still remains in the darker areas of the image, but they are not as intense as they were in the one-stop overexposure image. Similar to the highlight scene, we also wanted to film a low light scene so we could investigate the recoverable properties of each camera when they are underexposed. For the DXL, we noticed that the normal exposure was not terribly noisy. There is some noise present in the very dark shadows, but overall the image is acceptable. When working with the footage from the one-stop underexposure scene, we were able to still control some of the detail. There is more noise present in the image, but we were able to maintain control of most of the detail. When working with the two-stop underexposure image, we were still able to get a lot of information. There is more noise present as to be expected. When trying to use lift gamma gain to grade the footage to be visually similar, we were noticing that a lot of the color control capabilities had gone away and we weren't able to control as many features of the color. For the FS7, in the same lighting conditions as the DXL2, we noticed that in the normal exposure, there was a lot more noise present. There were also more magenta tones included in the image, and these were hard to get rid of without making the skin look pale. There were also a lot of blue tones in this scene as well, and it was difficult to balance the magentas and the blues in the image. For the one-stop underexposure of the FS7, we noticed that there was a lot more noise present in the image and the colors begin to break down. We weren't able to control as many separate features of the image as we were in previous exposures. For the two-stop underexposure scene, the noise has increased and there is no longer any separation between the dark of the scene and the actor's face. And overall, we would say that this footage is unusable. In comparing the DXL low light performance to the FS7 low light performance, it is clear that the DXL performs better in these low exposure situations. To end this whole shootout off, we decided to run the cameras through one last test with a large amount of colorful lighting to see how well they would handle a mixture of vibrant colors. Once again, in the comparison of the DXL2 to the FS7, the magenta tones in the FS7 are very prominent, making the red light appear not so red in the final product. In consideration of the Macbeth color checker chart displayed earlier, these noted characteristics have been a consistent difference throughout the scenes. Both cameras were able to handle a large amount of highly saturated colors illuminating the scene and allow for color manipulation without intensely clipping the values.
So all in all, what is there that can be said about the difference between the DXL2 and the FS7? Well, the DXL2 is a completely different beast compared to the FS7, having a greater exposure latitude with less noise, and its 8K Red Monstro sensor make it easy to understand why it's a big draw for large-scale productions. Still, the FS7 performed well, capturing sharp, high-resolution footage with color reproduction that may be desirable by some filmmakers. While the DXL2 is exclusively used for high-budget productions and required us reaching out to Panavision to gain access to it, the FS7 is an affordable camera that is more easily accessible. Both the FS7 and the DXL2 are great cameras in the market that they serve. This shootout allowed us to investigate the different qualities that come with the different brackets of cinema cameras. If budget allows, going with a camera like the DXL2 will allow you to have greater control over the image in post. However, the FS7 still enables you to capture a great image with a robust ability to affect the results in post. Thanks for watching.